Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you out of the brief spats of rain and against the World Cup to what I think will be a delightful lecture today by a colleague and fellow traveler, Paula Deitz, who contributed a lovely essay to the Tuileries catalog and who, in her professional life, has danced along the alleys of gardens around the world, embraces literature and the arts, and writes convincingly about the experience of the intangible, often evidence of place and time, and the people who've trod the alleys before her and in her spirit. She is the editor of a distinguished journal, the Hudson Review, a magazine of literature and the arts published in New York. A cultural critic, she writes about art, architecture, and the landscape design. For the New York Times, the Architectural Review, and Gardens Illustrated. Her book of gardens convinced me that she had to come to Portland. She had to experience our gardens, and she has done what I hope and think most of us do on a weekend. She went through the Japanese garden, the Chinese garden, the rose garden. She's going to see the forecourt fountain and the Halpern fountains in the South Royal Parks before she gets on a plane tonight. So we're glad she took time out to give this lecture, to be with us in Portland. Her book is a wonderful series of selected essays that take you into, I think, a reverie of how history and place, the plants that enliven a garden, enliven our memory in scent and touch and visually, can live across time. Please join me in welcoming Paula Deitz.
That's the best introduction I've ever had. That was really really wonderful. It always makes you nervous as a journalist, you know. You always feel you're only as good as your next article. So we'll see how we do this afternoon. But you are a city blessed with gardens. And to come, and I'm privileged to come and talk about a garden after having seen all these wonderful gardens in one day. It was absolutely a great privilege. And I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about how it came that I actually wrote an essay in the catalog. I got a call in the fall before it was due asking me if I'd do an essay, and I said, could you tell me who else and what the other topics are? And they said, well, somebody's going to write about the history of the Tuileries, somebody's writing about the sculpture, and these are all people at the Louvre who are experts for many years, because the Tuileries is now a curatorial department of the Louvre, and somebody was going to write about the photographs. And anyway, they went down the whole list, and I said, I really don't understand. What is there left for me to write about? I mean, I'm used to getting a very definite assignment. And they said, oh, just do whatever you want. But really talk about it as a masterpiece. The deadline was on a January 3rd. I never in my life had heard of somebody asking to finish an article on January 3rd, right after the New Year. But I was determined with this very elite group that I was going to make the deadline. So I had Christmas lunch with great friends across Central Park in New York. And my office was closed that week, and I had no engagements till New Year's Eve. And I sat down Christmas afternoon just wondering where I was going to start. And something quite wonderful happened when I began concentrating and opening my files. All these postcards fell out, and I'll talk about that later in the lecture. And it would seem that I had been collecting postcards when I went to museums of the Tuileries. And that made a kind of Proustian moment with Madeleine. It kind of opened me up, and so I could write this and then do the lecture that comes out of the essay. about the same time that I was traveling to Paris to walk up and down the Tuileries and meet everybody at the Louvre, and celebrating Andre Lenotre's 400th anniversary. I was also going to Geneva, where I was writing about Jean-Jacques Rousseau's 300th anniversary. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is really sort of the intellectual father of Geneva, and very influential on the creation of gardens because of his novels. So there's going to be a little Rousseau in this lecture as well. But really, I don't want you to think that I'm giving a lecture and talking at you. I would love it if you would think a little bit that this is a walk that you were taking with me in the Tuileries. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote once about a very idyllic sojourn on a lake in Switzerland, and how in later years he would transport himself there every day on the wings of my imagination. Now, in the experience of place, one never knows which one will leave a mark so indelible that the mind can conjure it up with complete satisfaction. I'm certain that you've all had that experience at some time. But since my student days in Paris, the Jardin des Tuileries has been such a place for me. Over the years, I've walked there in every season, but the time that frequently comes to mind is a late afternoon in mid-December, shortly after the Musée d'Orsay first opened. I had tea in a museum cafe behind one of the immense clocks at the top, and walked out onto the balcony overlooking the Tuileries across the Seine. It had snowed, and the sky was suffused with a dark bluish light. It's called Bleu in Paris. The Tuileries was a mass of bare branches, lightly powdered, and on the far side, set up for the approaching holidays, a small amusement park with a Ferris wheel and the glittering lights like jewels set in that dark expanse. In the distance, the whiteness of the church Sacre-Cœur glowed in the gathering dusk. Now, while my frequent walks in the Tuileries have merged over time, some stand out, like the first time I saw the Maillot sculptures there in the mid-60s. As you recall, the cultural minister, André Malraux, it was his realization of making a museum without walls, which is one of his ideas, and he placed the Tuileries, the Maillot sculptures throughout the Tuileries. Or the early spring morning when gardeners were trimming the screen of linden trees with long blades. Now, on a more recent walk, in a wall niche near the gate to the Place de la Concorde, I came across this Antoine Coisevaux bust of Andre Lenotre in a wig and a fine lace collar. Along with his dates, it stated very simply, auteur de ce jardin. And as I turned to continue my walk, I thought about this phrase, author of this garden, and how the word author usually implies a literary form, but also has the French connotation of an originator. I came to understand how it was appropriate, even though Catherine de' Medici's Florentine gardener, now you remember that Catherine de' Medici came from Florence, so when she came to be queen, she brought her own Florentine gardener with her to design the Tuileries as a Renaissance walled garden a century earlier for her Paris under construction, and that the garden had since undergone many transitions from elaborate curvilinear embroideries suited to royal taste to absolutely complete devastation during wars and political strife. It's very interesting in the show. You'll see the actual army tents that are set up in the Tuileries at different times of warfare. And incidentally, as you'll see in the exhibit also, the French word for tile is tuile, and it was the great site of the tile makers, so that's why it's called the Tuileries. And you can see her palace at the top, which is the palace of the Tuileries. Now, born into the Tuileries as the third generation of a dynasty of gardeners, Lenotre worked alongside his father as well as with other prominent gardeners, like the Mollet family. And he was really well versed in the routine of practical gardening, but he also had a very superior education in drawing, geometry, and architecture that qualified him to make architectural decisions about landscape and the perception of space. Now, while he almost certainly knew of André Molay, who's one of the other families, he had a 1651 book called The Garden of Pleasure. And this geometric plan was his idea of an ideal garden. But Lenotre had really gained enough experience of his own by 1664, when Louis XIV appointed him and the architect Louis Leveau to undertake the refurbishment of the garden here at the Tuileries Palace. Now, you probably have heard either in previous lectures, and you'll see in the show too, that Lenotre had designed a quite extraordinary garden for the finance minister of Louis XIV at a place called Vaux-le-Vicomte, and actually was put in prison eventually for doing that and upgrading the king. But when Lenotre worked at Vaux-le-Vicomte and then subsequently at Versailles, his accomplishments were enhanced by the opportunity to expand his designs into open land. But the Tuileries was a confined space already steeped in tradition. Lenotre's genius then, as the originator, was to discover how to be creative within the strictures of an existing discipline, circumscribed by custom and convention. So after first assimilating the decorative forms of the Baroque and Mannerist periods of the French formal garden, he then distilled them into patterns of a purified and enduring nature. In brief, he did not create the French classical garden, he clarified it, reducing the number of rectangular parterres, or the actual beds for the plants, enlarging those on the southern side to produce an illusion of symmetry, and alternating the parterres, the beds, and the groves, called the bosquets, as elegant configurations of turf and trees. The newly conceived classical green garden was Lenotre's gift to France. As Lewelling, a contemporary landscape architect, describes it, all that wonderful flat space with rows of trees. By elevating a long esplanade on the Seine above a retaining wall and inserting the horseshoe ramps at the far end, as well as a transversal terrace joining the garden with the palace, Lenotre contained the garden visually within its original precincts. So I have here two historic views. So this is the Tuileries Palace, and this is the transversal that he has there. And then you have the raised terrace here along the Seine. And this is looking the opposite way, so you have it really looking both ways here. And the long vista to the west, which you get right here, became the triumphal route on axis with the Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile, looking out as it looks today, and the Grande Arche de la Défense, which is now beyond the Arc de Triomphe. Now we have, for landscape architects in the United States, like Dan Kiley, Laurie Olin, Peter Walker, and Michael van Valkenburg, Lenotre still leads the way when they design urban parks and squares with formal combinations of green spaces and linear plantings of trees, attractive to city dwellers seeking respite. You have here above left the very famous iconic garden of the Miller family in Columbus, Ohio, by Dan Kiley. And below it, Bryant Park behind the New York Public Library in New York City by Laurie Olin. And at the top, which I'm sure most of you have now heard about, this is the National September 11th Memorial in New York, with 412 swamp oak trees planted by Peter Walker. And below, Michael van Valkenburg is a garden in Paris at 50 Avenue Montaigne, all of them inspired by Lenotre. In the Jardin des Tuileries, if the Jardin were in any other location, it would have been called a public park, and one of the earliest as well. But it has never lost its domestic ambiance as a palace, even though it lost its palace. The more I've been thinking about this, and after writing about it, it's absolutely extraordinary to me, not only, of course, that it was ruined, but that it disappeared so quickly. I mean, within a year or so, the ruins were just gone. So once it was situated in the open countryside, but now, it had distant windmills and countryside all around it. But it's now surrounded by dense urban life and the elegant arcaded buildings of the Rue de Rivoli. But still it remains one of the quiet promenades and a place for public celebration. When the enlargement of the Louvre under I.M. Payne Partners emerged as one of President François Mitterrand's grand projets, the Tuileries was included as an extension of the Louvre in the master plan for renovation. I'll never forget, actually, the summer day in 1991 when I entered the garden from the Rue de Rivoli and I passed a group of men from the Midi in a skilled game of boule on the Esplanade des Feuillants. And then I found my way into a temporary glass house to view the exhibition of their proposals. It was called a consultation by 8 teams to refurbish the Tuileries, without, according to Mitterrand, erasing the physical traces of the garden's historic past. And incidentally, the very sleek utilitarian glass house, it was in the northeast corner for the exhibition, was located almost exactly where Lenotre's own house was. So you can see Lenotre's house is right here at the edge of the Tuileries. There's a little glass house there. And it's not that they reproduced the exact house, but they did it right in the same area. Landscape designers Pascal Cribier and Louis Benesch won the competition to renovate the Tuileries with a plan that was later refined. But it is, again, a further clarification of Lenotre's style, but in a contemporary horticultural terms. They refer to themselves as wearing the shoes of the distinguished gardener. In addition to the models and plans, and I really love this because you can really see here how the city has just kind of crowded in on this. But one of their presentation drawings that they had in addition was by a California landscape architect named Barbara Sophocles Solomon. And she's an artist who specializes in imaginary views rendered in colored pencil of what she calls green architecture. And here she floated a seductive but foreshortened view detailing their plan of the groves and the planting beds and clipped trees over a street map of Paris, conveying at the same time both future and memory. At that point, the garden called the Carousel, extending from this 1806 Arc de Triomphe de Carousel, which celebrated Napoleon's victories, which really leads right into the historic Tuileries. And the Carousel, I'll go back. The Carousel was that space between the palace of the Tuileries and the Louvre itself. And it was an entirely separate entity, and the designers for that were going to be a Belgian father and son, Jacques and Peter Weerts. And this was once, and this inner courtyard was so named the Carousel because that's the name for an Italian-style cavalry pageant favored there by Louis XIV. And of course, that's why we have our merry-go-rounds and our carousels with our horses. So Paris's triumphal axis now begins at a copy of a Bernini equestrian statue of Louis XIV in the Louvre's Cour Napoleon next to I.M. Payne's pyramid. The Louvre is not on axis. The Louvre was they began building the Louvre in the 13th century, so that it was an entity itself with no concept of what was going to be coming afterwards. So the architects decided they had to have something in front of the Louvre that made the axis go through, and so they used the Bernini equestrian statue of Louis XIV. So the Carousel itself is, as it were, like a keyhole to the new Carousel Gardens, and the Wirtzes combined an Egyptian motif inspired by the pyramid and the idea of the sun's rays kind of radiating out like the pharaonic images in Egypt, or those that would emanate from Apollo as the sun god, because Louis XIV was the sun king. So what the Wirtzes did is they fanned out from the arch 6 pairs of radials comprising clipped yew hedges, like long twisted ribbons across the sloping lawn, with the Maille sculptures placed in between. And other Maille sculptures, and this is actually a sketch from the office of the Wirtz, but other ones were positioned in garden rooms of low clipped hedges, as well as aerial hedges of wonderful sort of clipped linden trees. Walking in the Tuileries Garden now, decades later, one can see that many of the improvements have matured as if they've always been there. Mitterrand was insistent on retaining the romantic look of the English landscape garden introduced when the Grand Carré, which is the part that was right next to the Tuileries, when it was appropriated actually by both Louis Philippe and Napoleon III as their private garden. And they actually put a dry moat in around like a fence so that nobody else could use it. And this is a painting in the show. This was taken 3 years, this was painted, it was painted 3 years before the destruction of the palace. But you can see, I mean, it was used for many royal events, and it became an entirely private garden for the emperor. With Benesh's horticultural expertise setting the pattern in the planting plans, the borders flourish spectacularly according to each season, and they've kept that idea of the private garden. Narrowing the paths between the lawns established a greater unity of green. Now the Grand Couvert, which is the central part of the Tuileries, the horse chestnut trees, and this is just another view of the spectacular borders that are there now. But in the Grand Couvert, the central part of the Tuileries, horse chestnut trees planted in the 19th century for their rapid growth and luxuriant blossoms were dying, and at least 800 of the 2,600 trees were replaced to maintain the enchanting forest of regimented rows of trees planted 12 feet on center. And you can see sort of in between this sort of spindly trees that were planted to keep the lines perfectly straight. It was important to Cribier and Benesch to maintain what they called the horizontal unity, or the open band of light above the clipped hedges and below the dark tree canopies seen far into the distance. This is one of the pleasures of sitting in the Tuileries, and also if you go to other gardens like the Palais Royal, when you're sitting, the trees never enclose you. You always have this wonderful horizontal band of light to look through. While sycamores and maples were already present in the 17th century, Cribier and Benesch introduced more for the effect of dappled sunlight they provide at midday, which rounds out the sort of low slant of Parisian sunlight. It's one of the great joys of Paris, because it's such a low city that the sunlight just floods it from the east and west at morning and evening. And one theory, of course, holds that there never can be too many water features in the garden. Here we have a group of people in the 50s, but they reflect the sky plane and they sort of glitter with light. And just judge from the permanent ring of visitors seated around the garden's basins, fore and aft, they serve as magnets to the public. Tucked away in the Grand Couvert, and I was thrilled to see that this is one of the sculptures that it's upstairs. They're absolutely very, very beautiful in this very special area. It was this sort of, there were 2 marble exedra which had sort of basins which had steps going down. And Benesch and Cuvier got the idea that they should fill these with water and make really botanical water gardens, very different from the other ponds. And so they introduced wonderful plantings of wild grasses, surrounded by trees and sloping banks of flowers and shrubs. They bring an intimacy to these enclosed areas and a nice touch of antiquity. Incidentally, this is a drawing by the landscape architect Laurie Olin, who has a wonderful cache of travel drawings, and I just thought this really conveys the sort of liveliness of being in that area. There is a late 18th century painting by Antoine Pierre Mangin, who himself visualized what to do with this, that Cuvier and Benesch had seen the painting, but they were the first to do it. It had never been done since the 18th century. Although much of the Tuileries is what you call palimpsest, with layer upon layer of civilization since Le Nôtre, little has changed at this western end by the horseshoe ramps since Le Nôtre's plan went into effect. The two rose garden parterres with volutes that really hint at the arabesque border, these sort of embroidered gardens of the past. They feature double-clipped box borders with beds between of mixed seasonal flowers and roses. With tubs of orange trees lined up on either side of the octagonal basin, the whole composition offers a visual satisfaction comparable really to a symphony rising to a crescendo before it descends to the final chord. And when you see the film in the show, the marvelous three-part film, you will see that it ends with your time at this ending, and it does have that feeling of the symphony and ending at night on a chord. And it just captures all the orange trees and the plantings. I think it's a fabulous film the way they've done it, because they've captured that feeling of walking the whole length of the garden and then ending at this wonderful point. Now, while the Tuileries Garden survived the Renaissance Palace, to which it originally was an appendage, the palace has remained really a phantom presence. I mean, one's always aware of it. Although the garden was incorporated into the original Grand Louvre development, once the garden was completed, the Tuileries was maintained by another entity called the Center for National Monuments. But the Louvre, after all, is a palace itself, and a much older one. And so the decision to recognize the Tuileries as its own garden, with all the graciousness of a welcoming front yard in American terms, was really an enlightened one. So annexing the Tuileries as part of the Louvre in 2005 opened the way again for its further greening and renovation, in consultation again with Pascal Cuvier and Louis Benesch, and under the auspices of the Louvre's curatorial department. So at the time had come in my walk through the Tuileries to meet the head gardener, 35-year-old Pierre Bonnard. If anyone was wearing Le Nôtre's shoes now, he was. The gardener's house had been gone long since, so I could not imagine where I found him after I made the appointment. Excuse me. There was no building in the Louvre. I mean, there are many little restaurants and so forth, but there was no main building in the Louvre. So he gave me directions, and the rain had just lifted when I entered the garden after crossing the bridge called the Pont Royal over the Seine. Now, for many years, well, since the 80s actually, I wrote in the 80s about a very famous garden called the Deserts. And at that time, I met the owner. You don't become long-term friends with everyone you write about, but at that time, it was a very charming couple, Jean-Marc Heffler and his wife, Sibylle. And when I came to Paris the next time to see them, they came to pick me up at my hotel and were pulled at my room. And they said, "Pack your bag, you're coming home with us." And I've been at home with us ever since. And when I'm in Paris writing an article or this essay, they always want to know what I'm doing. So I had just the day before, I had my visit with the gardener and was explaining my route, whereupon Jean-Marc got up from the breakfast table, went into the next room, and took off the bureau this painting. And this is exactly my route. I crossed the Pont Royal, and you can see this is a painting by Giuseppe Canella from the 19th century. And you can see the raised terrace, and there is an entry right at the end of the terrace into the garden. So this was exactly where I was walking, and it was very thrilling. So I decided to include the painting in my lecture. So I crossed the bridge and went around and turned left according to Pierre Bonnard's directions, and I walked along the stone retaining wall supporting this terrace called the Terrace du Bord de l'Eau, on the board of the Seine. And I walked along the stone retaining wall under it, and there were trees coming along. This is what it looks like on the top. And again, this is another one of those beautiful travel drawings by Laurie Olin. So I'm walking down beneath under it, and as I go along, there are sort of more and more greenery and plants, and when it gets really, really thick, I see a door, and I open it, but it was not to a secret garden, it was to a labyrinth of offices under the esplanade, including the one that Bonnard shares with his second-in-command. So spread out on his desk was a botanical list of plants used by Le Nôtre. He's getting his doctoral thesis on this subject. And of course I asked, being a journalist, a hungry journalist, if I could see them, and absolutely not, he said. But in preparation from our walk, he did provide me with this extraordinary print, an old print, and it shows one of the bosques right in the middle that he was redesigning with a grove of trees. Now, in the 17th century, a grove would have been planted in patterns of 5, very specifically, with no opening at all, just solid trees. But this has now evolved into a very simple, symmetrical plan. And in this one, a clearing has been left at the center for an abstract sculpture, surrounded by a rectangular planting of 116 trees in concentric rows of diminishing heights. And he differentiated each kind of tree by color. So there's a true service tree, European hornbeam, Italian maple, wild cherry with white blossoms, and along the border, of course, the horse chestnut trees. So I left the office with this color-coded chart indicating the very specific tree locations, along with this sketch showing how the trees look now, right after they're planted, but how they will appear at maturity in this wonderful slanted design. So later I walked over to see the freshly planted saplings, trunks still wrapped in burlap, each one wired to a wooden barrier, while workmen were still piling wet earth around them. This is 21st century horticulture, but it certainly looked like the 17th century to me. You know, when you think about it, when Le Nôtre redid the garden, it would have been 50 to 60 years before people living in that time would have seen the kind of mature gardens that we're seeing now, because it's all very young and it takes a very long time. But our first stop in the garden together, walking, was at a bosque to view a collaborative illustration between Pascal Cribier and the artist Giuseppe Pannone in response to the storm of 1999 that felled many trees in the Tuileries and across a swath of northern France. Trees are integral to Pannone's work, and here a many-branched, 13-foot-long dead tree in bronze, titled the Val Tree, lies across a wild garden. At each of the 5 points where a main branch touches the garden, a tree of a different variety has been planted. And within the tangle of exposed within the tangle of exposed roots, it's called the Val Tree because you can actually see the letters of the vowels. And again in the film upstairs, you'll get a really marvelous look of this entire garden. Very beautifully done. And our next stop in the garden was, and this is so sad really, we passed one of the elaborately carved stone arcades to the loggia of the original Tuileries Palace. This is all that remains, but it's a remnant now that serves simply as the Garden Folly. Climate change continues to have a detrimental effect on the horse chestnut trees by scorching and eventually killing them with sunlight. To avoid this from rapidly happening, Bonnard has had complete rows of tree trunks painted white, One future solution, he says, will be to replace all of them with trees like the Turkey oak from eastern Turkey, which would already be acclimated to similar conditions. As we reviewed areas that have already been replanted, Bonnard shared his plans to make the Jardin des Tuileries more of a garden, increasing plantings under the tree canopies with ferns, for example, and by covering stone walls with vines. In general, he would like the numerous people who crisscross the garden, because it's, communication right across the city, but he'd like them to spend simply more time enjoying it. You need not worry about me. Our walk really went on the list of one of my most memorable moments. Well, when I opened one of my files, as I told you, on the Tuileries to prepare for this lecture, what came tumbling out were several postcards of impressionist paintings of the garden that I had collected over the years from museum exhibition shops. Since the Tuileries is often on my mind, I am always pleased to discover a new view that takes me back in time to another present. One of them from the Israel Museum is from the series that Camille Pissarro painted in 1900 from his apartment at 204 Rue de Rivoli, overlooking a view in afternoon sun of the round bassin, or the basin, at the eastern end, which is now the watercourse for toy sailboats, surrounded by gardens, the ones that had been reserved for Napoleon III and his family. When the renovated 19th century gardens at the Metropolitan Museum, the 19th century galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art reopened in 2007, I became a frequent visitor to the Pissarro Room, where 3 of these views from the artist's 1899 series are lined up on the same wall. One, a morning in spring that you have here, and 2 on winter afternoons, each with a small shift of viewpoint and dramatic cloud formations pierced by Parisian light. Seeing the pale green leafed-out trees of spring, trimmed up high in the marquise style of the 19th century fashion, as opposed to the very straight way that they're now pruned. But this view reminded me of a moment in Henry James' novel, The Ambassadors, when the main character, Lambert Strether, imbibes Paris on his return there after many years. And this is what Henry James wrote. In the garden of the Tuileries, he had lingered on 2 or 3 spots to look. It was as if the wonderful Paris spring had stayed him as he roamed. The palace was gone. Strether remembered the palace. And when he gazed into the irremediable void of its sight, the historic sense in him might have been freely at play. He filled out spaces with dim symbols of scenes. He caught the gleam of white statues, at the base of which, with his letters out, he could tilt back a straw-bottomed chair. Of course, this meant that Henry James himself had walked in the Tuileries both before and after the palace. But in studying these Pissarros, I realized that the sculptures Strether alludes to lining the walks, mostly of marble, but many now of casts, from the 17th through the 19th century, provided then, as they still do, a vertical punctuation mark that enlivens by their very shapes and subject matter the otherwise pristine flatness of green parterres. As fashionable people stroll along what they call the terre stabilisée, the pathways of fine pressed gravel and soil, one can see an occasional dab of white denoting a nursemaid's headdress, or in one of the winter scenes, you look very down here. If you look down here, it's not the exact scene, but when I took out my magnifying glass and I thought this could only be that, right? Right down here, all the children with their chaperone going there. The schoolgirl procession with Miss Clavel. But no chairs in sight. Though in James' 1903 novel, they were there, as they are actually in this 1906 sepia photograph by Eugène Atget. These are exactly those chairs with rush seats that James describes in his novel, The Ambassadors. Chairs for hire were first introduced in the Tuileries in 1760, and what would we do today without the ubiquitous pale green metal chairs with straight or comfortably inclined slat backs that can be moved about? In a December 4th, 1898 letter to his son Lucien, Pissarro wrote of engaging this apartment, facing the Tuileries, with a superb view of the park, the Louvre to the left in the background, the houses on the quays behind the trees. To the right, the Dôme des Invalides and the steeples of Saint Clotilde behind the solid mass of chestnut trees. It's very beautiful, he wrote. I shall paint a fine series. This letter mentions that he has rented the apartment at 204 Rue de Rivoli and plans to paint a series based on the view. In all, he painted 28 in the series of this view. And you'll see many of them several of them upstairs. 14 paintings each, 1899 and 1900. And actually, when I was in Paris, I made the hotel let me walk upstairs. I found out exactly where it is so I could look out the window and see what he saw, which was wonderful. Rebecca Rabineau, who is the curator now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Department of Modern and Contemporary, but was formerly in the 19th century art overseeing these paintings, has studied these works closely and believes that they demonstrate how Impressionist painters took a critical look at modern life. Here Pissarro is commenting, she says, on how French society uses and values parks. And she pointed out that stark winter contrast between the bare trees and brilliant green parterres, and how the diagonals of light through the clouds and slanted shadows of the people especially enliven the winter canvas. In 1876, Claude Monet painted a similar scene across the central bassin to the Pavillon de Flore, which is a surviving wing of the Tuileries Palace, but a slightly different angle from his apartment at 198 Rue de Rivoli. While executed only 5 years after the burning of the palace, the emperor's bucolic landscape is still intact. Viewing the painting up close at the Musée Marmottan Monet, I could see how the floral borders framing the greenswards, shades of Monet's own garden at Giverny, look very much the way these same borders appeared last autumn, with profusions of dahlias, cosmos, rudbeckia, salvia, and ageratum. Only the elegant and parasoled pedestrians and the uninterrupted left bank skyline give away the time. And yet the point is that the Jardin des Tuileries is timeless. So go see the show. Thank you. I was told we could have a few questions if anyone has one. If not, you can come and talk to me for a few minutes afterwards. Are there any questions that anyone would have about it? Fine, then anyone who wants to talk to me, come down. I'll be here for a while afterwards. Thank you very much for coming.